But I want to be really careful to do this so that it can't be misinterpreted by anybody.
I'm gonna enjoy watching this.
Are you? Okay.
Why would we as a society allow an industry to drive both men and women to behave like men who are behaving badly?
Birth control is an extraordinary innovation.
The choosiness of females, the competition between males to win the attention of females, all of these things make sense, and they're written into the structures that we are increasingly abandoning. That's the world we should be seeking to create. It's the world that we should be arranging for our children. Our minds do not look alike on the inside. We function differently. And so every human being should have a relationship with music, which is not just simply listening. The fact of anti-Semitism, it is so easy for it to be triggered. It is so, in some way, I hate to say it, but...
All right, welcome to Bring Me Our podcast. It's a huge honor because we are sitting here with Heather Hain and Bret Weinstein. Welcome to our show.
Thanks, we're thrilled to be here.
We really are. Thank you.
You went all the way to Prague. You've been in London. You are originally from US, and I would like to introduce you guys just a little bit. So Bret and Heather are evolutionary biologists who earned their Ph.D. at the Michigan University, and both of them were professors at Evergreen State College until 2017, and then visiting fellows at Princeton University. They now host the Dark Horse podcast, and in 2021 they've published their book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. And there's many interesting things about you. You've also done field work. You'll have to travel, Heather, as I gather from your website. And yesterday I found out a very interesting thing that you've discovered about more than 20 years ago, Bret, about the telomeres of mice, which is like, it feels like a profound discovery. That's why I'm mentioning it here. We're not gonna dig into that right now, but I wanna get into that later as well. But these are all different labels that people throw at you, right? Evolutionary biologists and stuff like that. How would you kind of describe yourself without the kind of the public eye that's there?
Evolutionary biology turns out to be a model that allows a person to navigate a wide range of topics from first principles. And I think we are facing a crisis. I think you've discussed it on your podcast as the meaning crisis. And the meaning crisis requires that we escape the standard modes of thinking. The standard modes of thinking have been corrupted by many forces, some of them economic. But in order to think in some new fashion, you have to figure out where to start that is not polluted by whatever drove you into a dead end in the first place. So first principles thinking is the way to do this. And evolutionary biology is really the name for the type of first principle thinking that applies to complex adaptive systems. And while complex adaptive systems may sound like a narrow topic, in fact, it covers almost everything that people care about. It covers the way their lives function at a day-to-day level, the way they choose to fall in love, have families or not. It applies to our political systems, our economic systems, our legal systems. It applies to anything that is downstream of biology. So we are generalists. What we do is we think about topics that matter, and we use this toolkit and build it out for whatever topic is important for the moment.
Yeah, I agree with that. Evolutionary biology really is the scientific description that is most broad and most generalist. But there's one additional one. There are many ways that you could accurately describe sort of how we think, what we do. But animal behaviorist is another one that is slightly narrower. And is fully enclosed within evolutionary biology, but further describes how it is that we understand what organisms are doing with one another. And of course, humans are animals, and so we include ourselves in that. And so an approach that seeks to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, but in that order, rather than trying to figure out why before you figure out what. And that's part of the ethos that's in the book as well.
And if I can point out one place where this becomes very important, human beings have a a special gift, the thing that really does make human beings utterly unique among all creatures, is our capacity for language. The ability for one human being to take an abstract thought and put it into the mind of another human being is something no other creature can come close to. But it creates a hazard for us in terms of understanding our own interactions, which is that we are overly compelled by what we say we are doing. And so Heather and I have talked frequently about the fact that when interactions are confusing, very often the thing to do is to turn down the volume so you can't hear what the participants are saying about their behavior, and you can only look at it. If you treat it as a primatological question, it's often very different from the question if you're zoomed too close in and you hear the parties saying why they're doing what they're doing. Even thorny questions like what is taking place in the Middle East are bewildering if you try to sort it out through the question of historical rights and wrongs. If you turn down the sound, you understand actually these are populations engaged in a long-term struggle for survival. But that long-term struggle for survival contains the impulse to displace. When you think of it in those terms, A, it becomes much easier to see the hazard of this. And B, it becomes much clearer why it would be what's called a wicked problem, a problem that is very difficult to solve with very important implications.
Mm. What you're saying, it almost seems like we are silencing some kind of like relevant feedback from our environment, and we are focusing on one particular thing that we are good at. And you also mentioned that we are generalists, and in a book you wrote that very specifically that humans are generalist platform. What does it mean? Can you elaborate more on that?
Most organisms are built to exploit a single niche. Selection has refined them to exploit some particular opportunity. That opportunity can be broad. An animal can be a scavenger and it can look for dead animals, or it can be very narrow. It can specialize on one or two types of fruit, for example. So there's a breadth to niche, but mostly, almost entirely, species are restricted to a niche. This is not what human beings are. Human beings are unique in that without changing our physical structure, without altering our genes substantially, we can move from one niche to the next. And in fact, this is not just something that we do in time. We do it across space. Human populations can exploit very different niches simultaneously, and the way that's accomplished is by the genome has offloaded the adaptive capacity to the cultural layer. So human beings innovate a new niche in the software rather than the hardware, and then that new niche defines how they extract resources from the environment and distribute them and all the things that people have to do. So the point is the robot that we are is capable of doing anything from intensive agriculture on the side of a mountain to hunting marine mammals. That's an incredibly wide range of things that the body is capable of doing. But you can't take somebody who hunts marine mammals and say, okay, now, grow potatoes, at 3,000 meters, right? That's not going to work. It's all in the software layer. So the generalist platform is like the robot. And when I say robot, I'm talking about an aqueous robot, a wet machine. That machine is capable of doing a great many things by swapping out the software program. That's what we mean.
I would like to get to kind of frame this conversation with your argument on the start of the book about hunters and gatherers. Is that also because you can take the hunter and gatherer, which is biologically very similar to us, you can put him here, and if you dress him as us, you wouldn't maybe even notice. Maybe you would notice, he's acting a little bit weird, but maybe that would be because of his software layer. Is that the argument that the humans are kind of similar as we were 100,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago? But what changed is the drastic change of the environment that we are living in, and therefore it's unprecedented change, never seen before in evolution. Is that a framing or argument that you are putting forth, at least a part of it? Could you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, it's certainly part of it. There's no chance a hunter-gatherer if you dressed him up and put him on a street in Prague, would pass behaviorally, right? We would know for sure. But physiologically, anatomically, the way he looks, he should pass. Because a hunter-gatherer from 20,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, is an anatomically modern human, as far as we know. Since about 200,000 years ago, we've been more or less the same at the hardware level. And yet we've had a tremendous amount of behavioral change and cultural change and consciousness change. So we say, I believe early in the book, we've called this a hunter-gatherer's guide to the 21st century because we are hunter-gatherers still, because you cannot change what you were, even though you can be something new now. But we could have equally well called it a fish's guide to the 21st century, because we're still fish too. A mammal's guide to the 21st century, a primate's guide, or moving forward in time, an agriculturalist's guide, or a post-industrialist's guide. And we all sort of recognize ourselves as post-industrialists at some level, but it's harder for most of us to think in these evolutionary terms that say, yes, you're both not that anymore, but you also are still that. You also are still an agriculturalist and a hunter-gatherer and an ape and a monkey and a mammal and a fish, right? All of these things. And people get stuck on various parts of that, but it doesn't make it any less true. And so, to what degree is our fishy ancestry still with us? Very much so. We still have some proteins in our bodies that are as functional now as they were when we were swimming in the seas. And also, we're not breathing water anymore. That's obvious. So the more remote it is in history, the more fundamental at some level, but also the less interesting to us as humans, because it is less descriptive of what makes us human.
If I can add a couple things. There are modifications that have happened to us since we were hunting and gathering across the entire species. For example, the ability to break down lactose as adults is something that has physiologically changed in populations that have a dairy culture where milk is consumed as adults. So it's not that there's no modification of our physical structures. And it is also true that we are not, even at the hardware level, we are not all the same. There are profound physical differences, for example, between Inuits who are exploiting an Arctic habitat where the loss of heat is a great danger. They have a rounder form because it reduces their loss of heat to the environment, and somebody who lives in a very hot environment would have the opposite form. They would be lanky in order to radiate heat into the environment. So we are modified across space and time, but the platform is general, and that's the key thing to remember.
As we are like generalists, what are the trade-offs? What are the main trade-offs that maybe we are not that good at anymore in today's world? And what's creating the problems of like on the individual level and on the societal level?
Well, there is a major trade-off that is haunting us at the moment, which is the way the accumulation of new and useful culture would typically take place is being disrupted by our modern technical capacity to exchange ideas across arbitrarily large distances. So it is true that if we look backwards in history and we take any behavior that human beings engage in over a long span of evolutionary time that has an expense that people are spending time on, they're seeking materials with which to do it, we can infer that this has to be adaptive. It has to be good at an evolutionary level for the creatures doing it. In modern times, we have an explosion of new behaviors, and you cannot look at them and say, well, these things, they're taking a lot of our time and effort. They therefore must be useful to us. In fact, many of them are positively toxic, but we won't be able to sort the good behaviors from the bad behaviors until 300, 400 years from now when we can see which ones have persisted. So the amount of noise in our culture is absolutely through the roof. And what's worse, because of the way the economic system works, there is a value in reinforcing people's wasting of their time and effort and mental capacity on frivolous things because it allows them to be a source of monetary enrichment. So we have become essentially parasitic on each other, using the economic system, causing a chaos of behavior that is senseless.
And just going back in time a little bit, physical trade-offs are such that we're not best at really anything if you compare us to other organisms, right? We're not the fastest. We're not the best climbers. We don't swim the best. But with our technological innovations, with our cultural innovations, we've pretty much become best at everything, right? We can certainly move faster across the landscape and underground and overground and through the water than anyone else. And there are other, you go farther back yet, and bipedality certainly brings with it trade-offs that make us somewhat unstable and make childbirth difficult and dangerous and all of these things. But at the advantage of now, we have these hands free that we can do things with, and from there you can start manipulating your environment in a much more capacious way.
So I wanted to actually, the way you asked your question, I don't think we fully answered it. The noise in our culture is actually the downside of the capacity of our culture to adapt inside of a generation. The fact that this is done in the software layer means that we have this rapid capacity to adapt, but we also have the capacity to embrace total nonsense all of a sudden. And that is a grave danger to us. There's also, if you have a capacity built in at a genetic level, a capacity to digest, for example, some material that you're eating, and then that material is no longer available because you've moved somewhere else, the ability to digest it does not disappear right away. But with capacities that we carry at a cultural level, you can lose them in a single generation, and then regenerating them may take many generations. So the risk of the loss of useful capabilities is a key downside of the amazing capacity to revolutionize your behavior in one generation.
That's really interesting, and I actually think where you're going with this, but can you maybe specify what, can you put some examples of this bad behavior that is creating noise in our individual level that's harming us in a way?
Well, I'll give you an example of an easy loss, which is not modern, but imagine that you were from a seafaring people that used dugout canoes to transport yourself between islands, and you found a very large landmass. In one generation, the ability to make canoes would be lost, potentially, unless there was some effort to preserve it for no reason. So that's the example of loss. From the point of view of the chaos of modernity, let's take an example that immediately will cause people to polarize over whether what's being said is in some way a challenge to something important. The proliferation of pornography is having a profound impact on the way people interact with each other at a sexual level. And there is truly nothing new about erotic content being distributed. Erotic content is clearly an ancient fascination of people. Our museums are filled with it, frankly. But what has happened is that the economics of porn causes those who produce it to compete for attention. And in competing for attention, given that they are distributing materials that cover the same topic as every other person in that market, they have to find something novel. So the idea that the thrill of sex is synonymous with the novelty, with finding something, forces them to embrace taboo behavior. And the fact is, taboos are there for a reason, but we don't always know what that reason is. So the idea that people are forbidden to even think along certain lines has to do with the fact that those who did think along those lines were outcompeted by people who didn't. That's how it got written into our culture. So now we have an economic system that is exploring that as material to distinguish their version of porn from everyone else's. And then that is affecting how people developmentally come to understand their sexual relationships with their partners. And this is creating absolute havoc. There's no question in my mind that this will be weeded out by selection. The people who resist this temptation will be better off than people who embrace it. But how long will it be before that lesson is understood, and at what price will be paid in the meantime?
This is really interesting. I love this so much. It almost seems like we learned some kind of behavior or habits that we are repeating without thinking about it anymore. Like what's the original purpose? And could you please add to what you just said and explain the concept of sexual autism?
It's been a little while since I've thought about this.
So that's fine.
And we've taken a lot of heat for this term.
Oh, right. Okay.
So, maybe I'll come up with it. Okay, sorry guys.
The way in which developmentally we come to understand our potential partners, really some of the most important relationships that we form in a lifetime, is something that has been built by selection in a completely non-intuitive way. If you stop and you think about the role that, for example, couple dancing plays in the formation of these relationships, it is clearly in some way related to sex, and it is also clearly not the same. There's no obstacle, and in fact, it is formalized in our culture, at least, that at one's wedding, the father dances with the daughter as a ceremonial fact. So there is nobody, I believe, on earth who can describe to you what role this is playing. But what we have is an embrace of the idea that this is somehow a way to spend time. It's entertainment. And so the idea is, well, why would we do that the way our grandparents did? We can dance in a big group, right? What does it matter what you're doing? If you're enjoying it, it's good. If you're not enjoying it, then don't do it. And we all get the logic of that. But the problem is, because you don't know what role it is playing, has anyone ever even asked the question, in cultures that have a tradition of couple dancing before one commits to a marriage, do they have a lower divorce rate? And is there anything to say about whether or not they established whether or not the chemistry in the relationship was a durable type of chemistry or an ephemeral type of chemistry? So we don't even ask these questions because there is almost an assumption written into the way we interact that which is old is largely outdated, that your initial reaction to something is a good guide as to whether or not it's good for you. And, we can see in our relationship to food that's absurd. So, the question of sexual autism is really one of a disruption of the developmental patterns that would create a normal human capacity to interact on this particular channel.
So you asked about sexual autism, which we invoke as a term that can describe people who are addled by porn. And the idea is that autists, people on the spectrum, often react to the world as objects that cannot respond. And so they have fixed patterns, fixed responses to the world. And what porn can do is create a menu of sexual possibilities as opposed to allowing people to actually experience themselves and their partners as an infinity of possible experiences, right? And so if you watch porn and you learn that what's on the menu is items A through F, and that's it, and even put aside the fact of the violence and the aggression, right? Like even if options A through F are all consensual and potentially enjoyable to both partners, when that person who's learned about sex through porn actually interacts with a real human being, they're going to think that it's only options A through F, that it's a menu, right? And that's not actually how touch works. That's not how emotion works. That's not how human connection works. We aren't actually digital, right? As much as, Bret referred to us being robots in some ways before, this is one of the places where I don't like this language because it makes people think that we are limited and that there are sort of quantum states as opposed to analog states that are continuous. So, the human sexual experience can be almost anything. And porn would reduce that to a very small subset and say, this is what you do. And then furthermore, when your partner does X, if you haven't seen that in porn as well, you don't know what to do. It doesn't make any sense. And so not only is the list of possible sexual activities limited, but the list of responses is even more limited. And so you're going to be responding not by actual experiencing each other, but by sort of remembering what you saw elsewhere, which is not what sexuality should be.
Oh, this is huge, actually. I think that we kind of exchanged the depth for the surface layer interaction.
Yeah.
And the kind of sad part is that it's not like we exchanged maybe even our first sexual interactions with the surface level ones. Therefore, we learn it this way. Yeah. And there's one more. I had like a little insight where we have so many options, and we are like novelty-seeking machines. Well, just novelty seekers, right? Mm-hmm. And therefore, we kind of also exchange the eroticism, and the attraction, and we maybe are mistakenly thinking that the novelty is the attraction, and that's the erotic part, right? Instead of the depth of maybe one deeper interaction when there is, the physical touch and everything and all the menu, the limitless menu that we have as human beings. And I think this might be a problem. I mean, it might be even a problem when I think about my life also. Like, I definitely watch porn sometimes. I try not to whenever I have a partner. So... But I think this is a huge thing, and I think we are kind of drowning in the novelty, and that it also is coming back to the topic we've talked about before, about the signals from the environment that are actually now not being true signals that are adaptive, but now there's the increasing of kind of fake signals that are disruptive.
Very much so. Let me just start. We privilege a few senses over others, right? Like, especially as primates, we tend to think in visual terms and consider, I don't know Czech, obviously, but how many words are there for what you see as opposed to for what you touch? And, we certainly can describe aspects of the things that we touch, things like texture and hardness and such. But the experience of touch, especially human on human or human on, your pet, right, is very hard to describe. And I don't know that is because we don't have the language, or we don't have the language because it is actually hard to describe. But all of the senses other than vision are actually a little bit outside of our consciousness more than vision. And that does mean potentially that we can learn more in those spaces, even though we're not as expert in them. And that also is part of what sensuality and sexuality is and what it brings to us. And like, we're not going to teach that in the school, right? But also, how could you teach it? It's inherently through experience, and porn is the visual only. That's all it is, and it's flat. It's inherently flat.
I wanted to respond to a couple of things that you said about your own experience, and try to use this trick of turning down the sound to figure out what's really taking place. The human male is wired with two general categories of sexual strategy. One of those categories looks very much like the human female strategy of a long-term investment in a mate and offspring. The other one is what a student of mine once called sow and go, right? Which is to inseminate someone and commit to them not at all. That second strategy is so evolutionarily positive from the point of view of spreading genes at minimal effort that two things are true. One, men are inherently obsessed with that possibility if it is available to them. And two, females are highly resistant to this at an ancestral level because the cost of being inseminated by a male who will not invest in you or your offspring is so astronomical. The cost of raising a human baby is so high that it would be absurd to consent to such a thing at that price. So ancestrally, this was all clear. Birth control is invented. It changes the stakes. It allows females to behave like men if they wish to, because the cost of a sexual interaction isn't high anymore, not inherently. But they're not wired to accept this as a trivial phenomenon. So many women have discovered that though they, I think wrongly, aspire to behave like men who are trying to have trivial sexual interactions, that they in fact find out that those sexual interactions trigger deep feelings, which then cause them to get hurt. So that situation exists. But the question is, why would we as a society allow an industry to drive both men and women to behave like men who are behaving badly? This is not a smart thing to do. It changes the nature of society. The second thing to say is that the sexual mind is creative, that it is not an accident that human beings spend a lot of time thinking about sex. Sex is profoundly important. But what you're supposed to be doing is developing your own sense of how this might work, which is a very personal, individual thing. To the extent that you are buying porn or watching porn that has been produced by somebody who doesn't have your long-term interests at heart, what they have done is they have taken something from you. Instead of being a creative sexual person who has something to offer to a partner, you are now a consumer of ideas that are driven by monetary incentive. So you say, well, you watch porn, you try not to. I would suggest two things. One, realize that you are robbing your future self, right? That what you're supposed to be doing, that energy that has you focused on this topic, is supposed to be driving you to increase your creativity, right? The second thing is that if you are going to look at porn, don't look at porn. Find erotic content. And the distinction is relatively easy to understand. Was this produced by somebody who was trying to say something about sex? Or was this produced by somebody who was trying to make money and will give you whatever it is that your mind will look at? That distinction is important. And if people realize that to take a position against porn, to say this is dangerous, that's not a prudish position. That is a position in favor of sexual creativity and in favor of sex being so profoundly important to the bonding between partners that it should not be disrupted by these trivial economic forces.
If I may just pick up on, you mentioned birth control. We haven't used the word hypernovelty yet, but it's one of the main themes of the book, right? The idea that even we humans, with the greatest capacity to switch niches and to adapt to changes, have outstripped our own capacity to adapt with the rate of change that we are creating. And part of how this manifests is with unintended consequences in the technology that we invent. And birth control is one such thing, right? Birth control is an extraordinary innovation. It opens up, fully half the population to be able to be in both a sexual relationship and to pursue a life outside of that sexual relationship, right? And what we see it being used as, in many cases, is exactly as Bret said, a way for women to act as men at their worst, right? To learn how to do what, it's not sew and go, obviously, if you're a woman, but to pursue that lifestyle, which doesn't really benefit anyone. It doesn't benefit the individuals involved, and it certainly doesn't benefit society. And so that's not to say that birth control isn't net a societal good. And it certainly has been extremely valuable to legions of women and their partners, right, in order to plan when it is the right time to have a child. But the use of it to encourage trivial sex in which women are acting like men at their worst is absurd. And it's one of many ways that we are in the 21st century misunderstanding the vast tools at our disposal.
It's also true that you can infer something about the importance of what we've lost by the huge fraction of the narratives that are at the core of our culture that is dedicated to the interplay between primarily men and women as they navigate these relationships. In fact, all sorts of traditions that we may recognize as antiquated are actually evolutionarily straightforward in terms of their role. The comparative sexual reluctance of females compared to males is obviously adaptive. The choosiness of females, the competition between males to win the attention of females, all of these things make sense, and they're written into the structures that we are increasingly abandoning. So, the process of courtship, that it may take, months, and that this may be an agonizing process. Sexual desire may be so great and frustrated by the slow pace of progress. These things have been radically altered by birth control because, of course, the obvious reason not to have sex is gone. But the degree to which that long-term romantic interplay, very asymmetrical. The role of men and the role of women is just different in that process. It serves to both test whether the relationship has the structures necessary to successfully partner in the raising of children, which is so profoundly important. But it excludes men who would play games and pretend to be romantically involved in order to gain sexual access. All of these things have clear evolutionary meanings, but because they are described in antiquated language and because the structures are remote to us, we feel we've moved past that. We're more enlightened, but in fact, what we are is less enlightened.
To me, it comes back to sex again, and do I understand it well? That we can, for example, the sex itself, we can perceive it through one category, and the category is maybe according to the rules that we are extracting from the digital environment. So we are acting in a way as we are incorporating some role that we've seen somewhere, some rule, but we are blind to other categories that are relevant for me because through sex, it can be the way of testing if we are compatible with this partner. So there's much more communication going on, all the touching and all the hormones, all the bonding. And we are actually getting rid of that and focusing on this one category that is a lot in today's world. I think a lot about performance, a lot about comparing myself to others, and I'm not aware actually about the creative sexual mind. I'm silencing the creative sexual mind down, and I'm acting as someone else, basically.
Yes, we learn to act like characters that we've seen, like other people's scripts. And I mentioned a menu of possibilities before. It's also like a multiple choice test. In what world can we imagine that what we want to be deciding what to do has been handed to us by people we don't know, who have interests that aren't ours, and who actually are trying to make money from us? Why would we accept what we are, all of the possibilities of what we are from those people? It doesn't make sense. And exactly as you say, all of what we do can be creative, and there is a nearly infinite set of possibilities of what we can do, both in terms of sexuality and everything. And instead, in almost every domain, we're being funneled into these narrow choices that have been decided on outside of our view and outside of our interests, and we accept them. And why do we accept them? It's a little easier. There's a lot to think about. We think we're focused over there instead. But every single one of these, if we break out and say, actually, your choices, A through D, no, none of those. I'm going to figure out something else. And maybe it turns out I'm going to come back and actually I'm going to accept a little bit of A and a little bit of C, and that's good. Or maybe there's Q, and you didn't get anywhere close to that. And this is actually an innovation that's maybe just good for me. And maybe it's also good for other people. And as long as it's not also bad for other people, let's go. Let's see what we can experience.
So I wanted to add something, though. I want to try out an idea. The idea is, imagine that there isn't really such a thing as having sex, that is the wrong description, because it suggests that a person does this thing and that there's some other person involved, because they would have to be. What's really true, let's look at the ancestral past. In the ancestral past, sex would have been vanishingly rare outside of a committed relationship because the cost to females of having sex frivolously was so high. In such a context, when one accomplishes all of the things necessary to actually engage in a sexual relationship, that relationship is then extremely personal, and it is extremely particular to the two people involved. They are both exploring a realm that they know exists. They've seen it depicted maybe, but they don't really know what it is, and they discover it together. That co-discovery is the stuff of human bonding in the most extreme sense. You have visited a somewhat forbidden realm together with another person, and you can't exactly, it would be wrong to describe it outside of that relationship. So it is a fusing force. And, if just by analogy, if we decided that there was something, there are pure colors and there's something called mixture, right? Mixture is when you take more than one color. Okay, but if I describe mixture, I've denied you a literally infinite range of possible hues that could exist by mixing these two in particular ratios. So the point is, any two people could engage in this thing that we generally say is having sex, but that does not describe what's supposed to be a fundamentally unique combination that one discovers and is private and is not discussed broadly. So that is something that we have lost, and we don't even realize that we were robbed of this, right? We are that rapid to embrace new ways of being that seem more modern that we don't realize we gave up something that profound.
And suddenly it comes back to the language and the trade-off of language, right? Because the language is, I want to describe the mixture. I want to describe what happened there, right? In language, and I'll give that to someone, and someone's like, it was like that. Okay, I don't need that maybe, or wherever. It was like that. It was A, B, or C, but suddenly we are coming up with a solution to type of a solution to go into the deep connection with someone and experience things which are beyond the language.
Yes.
Yeah.
Outside of language.
Outside of language.
Absolutely outside of language. And so much of human experience actually can be.
Yeah.
But because the way we communicate is primarily linguistic, we forget this.
Yeah.
And we're doing it now, right? Yeah. And we're talking about a book in which we did it as well, right? This is all language focused. But when you are having sex with someone, or hiking in nature, or swimming in the river, or climbing a mountain, you're mostly not talking. Maybe on some of those experiences you are, but for me, that's not. It's outside of the linguistic layer. And there is more to be learned from not trying to impose the conscious, what do I think about this? Or what else is, we're talking about something else now, but I'm trying to experience this thing with all of my senses. And actually, that's what I want to be doing now. And then give me time, let me consider it. Maybe later, depending, we can talk about it and we can come to understand what it meant. But this, to come back to the animal behavior, right? Like this part of what we can do in understanding humans, watching other people and turning down the sound, as Bret said, is don't pay attention to their language either. As you're watching them, try not to internalize what they're doing in terms of terms that you already know, in terms of interpretations that you already know. Just watch. And this is easier if you're in a space where you don't know the language. So it's easier to turn down the language if you don't know, right? So this is one of the benefits of far off travel. It's one of the benefits of us being in Prague, where we try as we might a little bit. We can barely understand a couple of little words, and so it sounds like music, but it doesn't sound like lyrics, right? And so we can watch people and say, okay, I'm seeing a human interaction, and I have no idea what they think is going on because I don't understand the words.
So in listening to this conversation, which has actually been this is a stimulating conversation to have with people who are interested to have it. And I think I would sum up the perspective that we're developing. If you can describe it, you're not doing it right? That's the thing, right?
I mean, this is this is actually something that's really alive for us with Christoph, because we've been kind of exploring the 4E cognitive sciences, where there is the embodiment and abandonness, extended mind, and all these things, which are actually going beyond the language. And it feels like the language it's a label that is kind of constraining, and it's actually affecting how we perceive the world itself. And then, Heather, you said something really interesting, where you kind of follow something. Well, that's what I don't know what exactly you said. Well, it was the feeling I've had.
Great.
Of you saying that. It was like you follow something, but then you don't try to explain it first, but you follow something, the feeling or whatever is coming, right? You're silencing the mind and the interpretations and the labels and the language.
Yes.
And you do that, and then suddenly you didn't know why you did that, but then suddenly there's like the realization of explanation that is going to come up afterwards.
Yes.
So we don't have to know why we do everything.
Especially not in the moment.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this is something we've had a camp, kind of transformative camp that we do, a retreat with Ethan Kobayashi, and he goes into practices that are actually training you to do that.
Yeah.
To be able to be in the moment and to follow whatever. Oh, there's an apple. Oh, I want the apple, right? Wherever and then you have a tendency to run somewhere. You have a tendency to do something.
Yeah.
And then it feels good and it regulates you. And
and I'm being active, therefore I must be being productive in the world.
Oh,
right?
right,
Now,
right.
now I'm being effective and productive.
Yeah. And one more thing, there was this thought of like traditions being here. We've talked a little bit about traditions, and there's this thought of tradition is some kind of solving mechanism, or is solving a problem that we no longer know that is there. So therefore we shouldn't maybe get rid of all the traditions because it might bring up a lot of problems that we forgot we have. So that was another thing that I've kind of was there.
If I may pick up for a second, there are trivial versions of what you're talking about, where you come out of a movie or a piece of theater and the people you went in with say, oh, what do you think? Like, I don't want to pass judgment yet. I don't want to speak what I thought yet. I don't know yet. Let me consider it. So that doesn't matter that much. But a profound version of this is actually how innovation in science happens. And we think of science, many people think of science as not being creative. As that's the domain of the arts. Science is about numbers, it's about analysis, it's about logic, and we can write it all down, right? That describes a lot of the part of science, but not the actual origin of the idea. And the origin of the hypothesis, which stems from observation, from letting your mind go free, from letting it float free and not forcing it into particular domains and not being constrained by what you think you know and what the world thinks you know, and letting it come to you. And then letting it move around in your head a little bit, and then starting to drill down on it and say, okay, what would that, if that is true, what else necessarily is true? From what did I base that observation, and how could I test whether or not this is true? So the rest of the scientific process is indeed fairly analytical and logical and careful, but if scientists are only spending their time in that space, they're not going to innovate. They're not going to discover anything new.
I wanted to add to your theme. I think you're describing what people typically refer to as being in the zone, when you're just simply, you flow through something rather than thinking your way through it. And this fits with one of the concepts we explore in the book, which is consciousness. So the way I think people should understand this is your conscious mind is a tool for addressing novelty. It is not the tool that you would use for anything that you know well. A virtuoso is not thinking their way through a piece. They are flowing their way through a piece. Somebody who's really good at a sport is not thinking about what they're going to do next. They intuit everything and they move in a seamless way. And as soon as they become conscious, they choke, right? So we ought to aspire to live our lives as much outside of consciousness as we can. Everything about it is novel, and not in an interesting way. Just go to the supermarket and look at the ingredient list on something, and it's like, I don't know what these things are. I don't know what to think about whether or not I should eat them. It is a conscious question where there shouldn't be one. You should be able to go to somebody who produces food, and they will have put the thought into what's in it, and it shouldn't require your conscious mind. It should sound delicious or not. So a world full of novel problems that are constantly activating your conscious mind, but with no useful product, because you don't get anywhere new. You just puzzle over unresolvable questions. That's the opposite of the world we should aspire to. A world that is intuitive to us, in which flowing through the world is not a conscious activity, would then free our conscious mind to confront things that really matter, things for which that tool is appropriate. That's the world we should be seeking to create. It's the world that we should be arranging for our children, so that they are not confused creatures by the time they mature, but they are actually creatures that know what to point their focus on. And it's truly sad that we're not doing this.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of the centipede paradox, that if you ask centipede which of your limb is moving the fastest, and she'll focus like, okay, which limb is moving the fastest, and the whole system of centipede is like, it just crashes, like she can't function. And I think it's happening of what you all just said, that we can function on these like autopilots of our rational mind, that okay, what you think about this movie, and my autopilot just like starts going. So I'm just start like explaining things, and I'm in this rational realm that is actually like silencing my feelings and these like intuitions. And what also like Ethan learned us is like that I think that we can guide these intuitive feelings also with questions, because we are so good in like rationale, so we can use our rationale to get to our like intuitive feelings. And one of these questions is like, for us, what is real relevant is, what's alive in you right now? This like kind of question is actually like forcing you to focus on your feelings, on your like intuitive realm, and suddenly it's not like, oh, like this movie, like I think it was really good, and it has like this ratings on this platform and these kind of things, and this rational automata is going on, and suddenly, I don't know, like it was so strong that I need to have some time to put pieces together.
Yeah.
And suddenly like different kind of, the language is going from different place, not from here,
Yes.
but from the whole
What did you
like
think,
system.
as opposed to how did it make you feel? At some
Yes.
level,
Well,
question. Yeah.
I'm going to push back here a little bit, because I think that there is when I used to be a professor, I used to have one exercise I would do where I would get students to describe to themselves what their dreams were like, right, without talking to each other. And then I would have them describe it to the class. And it was universally shocking how different our dreams are from each other, right? Our minds do not look alike on the inside. We function differently. And so I know that I have this experience with a movie, right? So Heather does not want to immediately react to the movie. It develops in her over time. I'm wired differently, right?
Me too, by the way.
Right. I am thinking about the movie as I'm watching the movie. But here's the weird part. I know that I'm also doing the thing where I'm experiencing the movie, and my conscious mind is really just like a second spectator. So I know what I think about it at the end, but I will often have the experience of my conscious mind thinks this movie is corny, but some part of me is like holding back tears, right? It reaches me, and then my conscious mind is like, yeah, but the story doesn't really hold together. So, it's that conflict with oneself that at least is a regular part of my experience. But I wouldn't doubt that is not universal.
I mean, that sounds like a match too for what I experience. But I would say also that the time that you take before you deliver a judgment allows both the rational, the conscious mind, if you will, and the cultural mind, perhaps, to find connections within the analytical space that they could not have found, maybe. So maybe it wasn't a very good movie, but maybe it actually had some connections to other things that you know that you just haven't remembered yet, right after you watch it, right? So just letting it letting it steep, letting it percolate. I don't know how many metaphors I can have for liquids here, but letting it brew. How about for a while, such that you come to understand something more. It's not just that you're waiting for the emotional response to fill you, but you're waiting also for the analytics to mature.
Well, I mean, I will now watch movies differently, and I will try to figure out what my mind is doing. But I often feel like, in the case I described, where I'm clearly emotionally reached by something that my conscious mind is bored by or whatever, it's often there's a character, and the predicament of this character is particularly resonant for some reason, and the character is embedded in a universe that isn't well enough rendered. But it doesn't matter, because I still feel like, that poor character is embedded in a bad movie, but I get him,
This is amazing. This is producing the feelings. Like, it feels like me, at least I'm going beyond the language a little bit. Like, obviously we always go beyond the language, kind of like I'm trying to feel through what's happening here. And it's a huge thing for us. Like, we are, following you for a few years, and now we are sitting, in front of you face to face. This is amazing for me. Anyway, I wanted to go into the cultural realm versus the conscious realm. But before that, maybe, can we go back a little bit and just, come back to the campfire? How important campfire is for us, and what's beyond just warming ourselves up and warming our food?
It's part of what we're doing here, right? This is a kind of campfire.
So let me just lay out the model. We described a little bit earlier that human beings exist across a wide range of niches, and that's a very unusual thing for species to do. In fact, there really aren't other species that do that. The way that happens is that new software programs need to be written. So if you think about, for example, the predicament of the people who lived in the Arctic, these are people derived from Asia, who at the end of the last ice age moved into the Americas. They first moved into North America and then rapidly spread to South America. These were people who had a way of life. We know that this was a Stone Age existence. They had control of fire. They did not have agriculture. These were hunter-gatherers living under difficult conditions. And then at the point that they reached below the ice sheets, when they had gotten south, they were faced with two continents that had no people in them, that had a huge diversity of opportunities that they knew nothing about. They had been living for thousands of years in this one place with one habitat, and they had an indefinitely large number of habitats to exploit. So as they expanded across those two continents, they would have discovered animals that they had not known that could be hunted. They would have discovered plants that they could eat. They would have discovered that other plants were toxic. They would have learned these things. How would it have happened? Well, as we were saying before, the conscious mind, its purpose is to confront novel circumstances. As people moved into a habitat, during the day they would have been struggling to figure out what to do with these opportunities that were so new. But at night, because we are diurnal creatures and our eyes do not work well at night, it would not be productive to be stumbling around in the dark trying to hunt and gather. So they would have gathered around a fire, and the natural thing for a human being to do is to say, I saw this thing today, and they would place the knowledge about it into the collective realm. And then their partners would say, well, that's interesting because I happen to notice this other thing, and I wonder if, and I saw this creature and it looks like a so-and-so, but I don't know how we would hunt it because its behavior is this and that. And what would happen is they would end up parallel processing the information that they could gather from the environment. And the key thing is that parallel processing is even better than what we can do with computers that parallel process. These would have been individual people who had lived different lives. They had a shared mechanism for exchanging very precise, abstract concepts with each other. And their different strengths, their different types of creativity, their different experiences would have allowed the lineage to produce answers that were far superior to what each of them working separately could have produced, even if they compiled it. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That capacity would have allowed them to discover a new way of being consciously. And then once it was understood well enough to function, that conscious construction, clumsy, like uncompiled computer code, would have been written into a much more efficient package that could then be passed one generation to the next. It would not have been inherently literal. It would have just been catchy. It would have been narrative. It would have been stories that told you how to think about the various hazards and opportunities that would then be passed vertically through that culture. Now, that culture exists on whatever patch of territory that way of being functions on. And at the edge of it, the puzzle repeats. You get to the edge of that habitat, and again, we don't know these creatures. We don't know how to live here. We don't know how to find water. And that question of gathering around the campfire, exchanging observations about this new set of puzzles, and figuring out, bootstrapping a new way of being, that's the stuff of human diversity. So that would have filled these two great continents full of literally hundreds of different cultures. And it would also have allowed each culture, at the point that its opportunity had been exhausted, to generate a new way of being in place. So that immense behavioral flexibility is the fundamental difference between humans and other creatures. And Campfire is this central concept, because you have this apparatus that is incredibly capable of observing and deducing, and at night it is not in a position to be productive. So what does it do? It teams up with others and it exchanges the data.
There's a dynamism that you describe here that we have described in the book with regard to individuals going out alone sometimes, or in smaller groups and then coalescing around a campfire, right? Smaller groups coalescing into larger groups, parallel processing. But I feel like there's a fractal version of this with humans all the way up to global, where anthropologists refer to fission fusion groups among hunter-gatherers that spend times in smallish family bands, 20 to 30 people or so, and then come together once a year, a few times a year on some reliable schedule, and come together into larger bands. And they're exchanging people, they're exchanging mates, but it's mostly about exchanging ideas, exchanging information. And that also keeps them able to communicate with one another. So that keeps the lines of communication open in terms of language evolution. But maybe more to the point, it allows innovations to spread. It allows culture to spread. And so I think that this fractal dynamism, if you will, at the level from individuals going out and coming back to the campfire, all the way to small groups coalescing into larger groups occasionally at once a year, is part of our long-term ancient history, and it's one of the things that we are not doing anymore. The dynamism is failing. Right, that we have a global economy and a global world, and we have our screens that at any moment we can tap into everyone and anything that's online already, right? And so instead of there being like an organic periodicity to like, we're going to come forward at night, we're coming to the campfire. If night is falling, we're going to come to the campfire. If it's March on the Kalahari, I'm making that up, but then we're coming together into the larger group. As opposed to, I have a minute, I'm waiting in line, I'm going to go here, right? And it creates chaos in our minds, because instead of a organic periodicity, we have at any moment, I'm going to plug back into everyone. And really, we have lost our ability to spend time completely alone or in the smaller groups and not have the outside intrude.
So, this is interesting, because I think it is in some ways analogous to the question about porn. Because on the one hand, you're absolutely right about us having lost touch with how to be alone with our thoughts, right? The addiction to the device causes us to occupy time rather than to allow the mind to wander, which that's toxic, and we have to fix that. But there is something. I love your idea of the fractal campfire. I think this is right. And there is something like that alive. The podcast world, for example, right? As you say, this is a campfire of sorts. How does it work? Well, we're having a real conversation. That conversation will go out to many, and they will pick up that conversation. Now, the problem is they will pick up that conversation in an environment that is not neutral, in an environment that has an opinion on what we should conclude. And we've been living this throughout COVID. But the fractal campfire that desperately needs to be born in order for humanity to function properly is being disrupted by forces that are partially just foolish and economic and partially interested in us not being able to think independently of them. That there are conclusions that we need to reach in order to keep the power structure stable. And unfortunately, it's going to prevent us from discovering exactly the things we need to realize in order to get humanity through this very dangerous moment. So I do have hope that that fractal campfire exists, and that, you know, as dangerous as the devices we're using are, if they were leveraged in a different way, they could be a very positive force. And we've seen a lot of positivity, but we've also seen it disrupted.
Just to kind of sum it up, even for myself, is like there is a quote from the book: "The linking of minds is at the root of humanity's success." With the linking of minds at the campfire, right? Mm-hmm. And so we said that humans are generalists platform, but as individuals we can be specialists, and then we can share the specialty that we have with others. And therefore, this is the compounding effect of us sharing that thing. And right. There's amazing study done. There has been some problem that they gave to people. Only 10% of people could solve that problem. But if they gathered people in groups of 3, it wasn't 30% of them solving the problem. It was 80%. 80% of the groups of 3 people have been able to solve that problem. And this is amazing, and
that's a fantastic result.
Yeah. And there's another quote from the book: "We accurately pass a complex abstraction from one mind to another by simply vibrating the air between us. It is everyday magic that usually passes without our notice." And it really, we as a biologist we have studied neuroscience. For us, it's literally a magic. It's like my brain is activating your brain right now, your feedback is activating again my neurons. This is amazing. This is really like everyday magic. I call it, for myself, I've called it like everyday transcendence, because the speech is transcending myself and your speech is transcending yourself.
This is like brain VR.
Yeah.
That's it.
One brain is talking and others are like lighting up.
Yeah.
Yes,
that's literally it. And so it again feels like, we have this quick thing that we can do: pick up our phone and go into the surface level abstraction of and language. So we are getting back into language instead of us being at the campfire exchanging. There's much more information beyond the language itself, right? So we are again at this the same idea as with porn and all these things. So how do we do that? We created podcasts for ourselves. That's our campfire. But how can people create their own campfires? How can we do this?
Well, I think the key thing to recognize is that there's a theme that unites all of the stuff we're doing wrong in all these different realms, which is that, and we should get back to the relevance of the difference between what's going on in the Czech Republic and what's going on in the wider West. But the power of unfettered capitalism in which markets will return any answer that makes a profit, is to turn us into consumers in places where we are supposed to be something else, right? It is turning us into consumers where we are supposed to be citizens. It's turning us into consumers where we are supposed to be creative participants in sexual relationships. We are becoming consumers even in our own mind. It's how we see ourselves. And these devices, because they deliver us the stuff that we consume, are an important piece of that very toxic puzzle. So at the point you look at all of the things that you are consuming, that you are actually supposed to be producing, right? Every human being should have a relationship with music, which is not just simply listening. You are supposed to be producing music. Every human until a few hundred years ago would have participated in group singing. Many would have played instruments, but nobody would have been passive in these realms. I think step one is don't be a consumer anymore and give up on the modes in which, I have become maybe the only vocal opponent of the idea of entertainment and recreation. Okay, it sounds like I'm no fun. Right? This is, I think, not true. The point is,
It's not true.
these are the trivial versions of something profoundly important. If your relationship with comedy is just simply that you go and you listen to funny things and you laugh, but you don't know how to make a joke, well, there's an opportunity for you. Just learning, even the discovery that the very same words delivered almost exactly the same way produce a totally different reaction depending on the timing of the way you deliver the punchline. We don't even know what that means. It's obviously profoundly important, but we just, we have come to understand ourselves as something we aren't. And I don't know if you had it. It's possible that you were shielded by the Iron Curtain from the horror that is laugh track. But on American television, there was a huge range of not very interesting comedies, and there was literally a library that the tiny number of people who did the job knew very well, in which they could take laughs from audience that had been recorded separately, and they could infuse them into something that you were watching. And the point is that would cause the people at home to laugh, which is telling you that it wasn't the content that was making them laugh. It was the sense that they were in a room full of people who thought that was funny and they should be laughing too, this is a mind-bending, it is an affront to human dignity that we would do such a thing to each other. And yet, economically speaking, it was the obvious thing.
One more thing with regard to helping people create Campfire, I think is, and we don't do this, but we know people who do successfully, is a return to Sabbath. Is having a day, and it could be a day a week, and it could be a different period, but a day a week is a good period to use because we have a work week that is defined, in which you do not pick up the phone, right? And maybe you will define the Sabbath in different ways for modern times, but at least that, in which you do not go into that global world that is remote. And you only engage with those who are actually in your presence. That, I think, would help tremendously. Many people actually create Campfire on the regular.
And of course, your allusion to Sabbath points to the fact that every religious tradition has some ritualized self-denial, and presumably some fraction of these are about addictions and building the structures that are capable of controlling addictions so that they don't run your life. And, of course, we abandon it because it seems archaic, but it's not. We probably need it now more than ever.
Yeah, and doing a media fast, if you will, a screen fast, is presumably just as good for you as doing an actual fast, right? Cleansing your body of all of the intakes, the actual physical, chemical intakes, is known to have health benefits, and so too should we cleanse ourselves of the very modern toxins.
Yeah, it's actually connected to addiction, that we tend to put the locus of control, or our locus of control is put in the outside world. So when I'm scrolling passively, when I'm passive consumer, I'm actually letting things automatically to my mind and influence my future behavior, and I'm not thinking about it. But what's happening also is that these things, like every like, every share, every support of my social status, it's releasing the dopamine in my brain. And dopamine has its conserved function in evolution, and it's highlighting something that should be important for me, and some behavior that I should repeat in the future because it leads to some kind of reward. But what happens in today's world is that the dopamine distance and also dopamine in time, it's shortened. So I can pick up my phone and I can have the release of dopamine on demand. And that's the term cheap dopamine. The locus of control is outside, and it's also supporting this addictive behavior of releasing this kind of cheap dopamine. And it's teaching my brain that these things are important to me, but also it's silencing the harder things to get in the world. For example, the dating market. It's easier to pick up my phone and install some dating app than to go to the coffee room or something and ask someone out. So it's
risky.
Yes, it's hijacking my decisions, my real decisions in the world. And like part of that is passive consumerism. There's a really nice concept, differentiation between passive and active consumerism, that you need to be curator of your digital environment. You actually need to put a bit of this locus control inside yourself, but it's very hard to do that. Like because of this dopamine and addictions are so like conserved in our system.
So I want to just refine that a little bit. For one thing, I want to point out that this is quite resonant with something that our older son, Zach, said to us. He made an observation. I wouldn't have spotted it otherwise. I'm not sure either of us would. But he said, even the way people have altered their smoking is feeding into that same change in access to dopamine. So the idea is that there's dopamine available in very different quantities, but the ability to get trivial small hits is detaining us so that we are not pursuing big game, right? And, the idea that it used to...
About vaping.
Yeah, vaping compared to smoking a cigarette, right? A cigarette is I'm not advocating smoking, but a cigarette is a level of commitment, right? Because it has a cost and because there's an amount of time that you take, right? It actually is weirdly regulated in some more human form than something that you can have exactly one hit of in no time at all in between here and there. So that it's almost like a meta addiction. You are addicted to the little hits of dopamine, and it keeps you from detecting that you are bypassing access to huge hits of a much richer set of rewards because, I don't know, we're not video gamers, but there must be a video game analogy where there's lots of trivial little rewards and you're so busy with them that you don't strategize how to get to something important. And it really, the tragedy is, as silly as that sounds, this is squandering human potential. And human potential, for the reason that you describe, these miracles that we are uniquely capable of, that we're just applying to nothing. When in fact, your life could be full of meaning. There's plenty to do. This is a moment at which, frankly, much hangs in the balance. But you're going to be occupied with things that 5 years from now, you won't even remember why you cared.
Mm-hmm. I think like the game is a really good analogy here, because when you're a gamer, you can actually spend a lot of time in this like virtual space that was designed for you because you're not a programmer. But you are missing on a world that actually you can design your own game in the world itself.
Well, right. And if you think about, compare the Shakespearean view of romance to the modern trivial version of mating and dating. The idea is there's a richer game that exists out there. We know it exists because it's been described in great detail. And we also know, I think everybody, if they think about it, will realize that there is a level of, I don't even know what the right word would be. Reward is not right, but it'll have to do. There's a level of reward for finally winning the heart of somebody that you have passionately desired, that you have feared would reject you, that you have been through all manner of tribulations in order to get there. The idea, going to bed with somebody who has accepted you as a result of a long-term, complex investment over which you have spent a great deal of time thinking about the various risks, that is not the same experience. And to the extent that the way people get to the relationship that would generate that experience is through a lot of dating around and, this person does, maybe they're the one, that is a loss, even at the level of just whether you had this profound human experience at any time in your life, right? It's not going to happen many times, right? Maybe once if you're lucky, but that you would bypass it because there's some modern way of doing this that doesn't involve that. And maybe it wasn't even ever true. Well, yeah, it was.
This, in short, there is value not just in getting, but in wanting.
Oh, yes. And
And aspiring and trying, right? In the pre-success part,
Right.
there is value and enjoyment and passion and all of the good things as well. And there's not complete overlap. You can't just get to the I have it stage and have acquired all of the things that you would have gotten by not having it.
Absolutely. And the ancients knew this. And the ancients even, the tantric tradition obviously gamifies this, right? The point is the denial is used to elevate the passion. And what I think is a mistake is to imagine that because that isn't how it has felt when you have adventured in this realm, that it was never true, right? There are things that are like that, but this isn't one of them.
This is also connected to happiness research that I'll mention just one thing, and it is that people that had to overcome some kind of challenges and had maybe longer, harder path towards their goal, they report to be happier than people that had it easier.
Yeah.
Of course.
They have something to compare to.
Of course.
Yeah.
I think we should integrate again that the pursuit and the stress and everything, the hard times that are coming with the pursuit maybe of some big game that we want to play is part of the game and is part of why it fills us with something afterwards and maybe throughout even. Because if we had everything just by snipping our fingers, maybe we wouldn't be so interested in that. Maybe it wouldn't be as fulfilling. There's this idea of meaningful basically decisions or meaning itself, that we are losing it because of making tons of decisions that are actually not affecting our life very much. We are choosing between hundreds of types of shampoos and stuff like that. Oh, what am I gonna eat? Am I or order Chinese or Indian or something? And so there's many choices, but actually, if we go on to, I don't know, Tinder or onto dating app or something, if we go on to the existential decisions that were there before, now they are exchanged for something, for a swipe on an app. And then maybe I will meet the person, right? But well, if that doesn't work out, okay, I've spent some time, I've spent some energy, but I'm going to have the alternative later. It doesn't really matter what I do. Yeah. And this is creating the kind of meaning crisis in ourselves. At least it feels like that, right? Because, okay, what am I doing here? How does my decision even affect my life?
The stakes are too low.
Yeah, the stakes are too low. And Bret, you said the reward of the relationship after the hard times of winning someone's heart, it feels like the existential reward kind of, because you are discovering the other mode of being rather than just getting, oh, I've just had sex with someone after 2 dates or something. So it's this idea of Eric Fromm, right? The having mode and being mode, the existential modes, right? Because the having mode is we have sex and I have this social status and this amount of money and all these things. But the being mode is cultivated by the depth of experience and my cultivation of character through, for example, the relationship is amazing example because you can't reach that amount of depth anywhere else in the world. At least I think maybe some psychedelic experiences or something like that. Maybe they would be even amplified with the person, right? That you have the depth with already. So that's something that's been alive right now. I'm not sure what it leads actually, but
Well, your observation about all of the decision making that we do that has no implication whatsoever. I mean, what are the chances that the choice you made on your shampoo affects the way your hair looks enough to have a consequence on what job you get or who you end up marrying, right? It's a very low stakes phenomenon, but almost everything is like this. We puzzle mightily over who we're going to vote for, and then it turns out our vote has almost no implication on how society runs for reasons we don't know. But so we are, I think, used to having these seemingly important discussions about what to do, and then it doesn't have any impact. And what it causes people to do is miss the places where that's not true. So if I can take one dangerous example, a lot of people made a decision about how to deal with COVID based on that same principle, that this was a social phenomenon. It was a badge of honor to take the vaccine, and those who didn't were morally defective. But they didn't understand, no, actually they're going to inject something into you and it's going to interact with something called the immune system that you probably know nothing about. And the way it's going to interact with the immune system is going to have an effect not only on how you interact with COVID, but how your body functions going forward, how it deals with pathogens that you've never even heard of, right? Nobody seemed to understand that this was for real, and that the decision was a difficult one, and that if you didn't have any basis to make it, that defaulting to the sort of social, well, my people are doing X, so I'm going to do that too, was incoherent, right? So,
yeah, no, this is an important connection, I think, because we have a kind of brand loyalty, right? We live in this social universe in which we think we know, and we are disappointed usually that the implications of our decisions are low. And then we generalize to those things where the implications of our decisions are high. And we use the same social parameters to make those decisions, even when it's physical manifestations in the universe.
yeah, we're using social proxies for things, even when, frankly, life and limb is at stake,
Yeah.
which is tragic.
It's René Girard's quote that we tend to mimic desires of what other people desire, and we are actually blind what we ourselves desire.
Which is ironic because actually you can become instantly richer by desiring things that are different than what other people want. If you desire what other people want, then it's expensive and in high demand. If you realize, oh, actually, I like this thing that other people aren't so into, then the point is, oh, well, there seems to be a lot of that. So it's funny that we don't give ourselves a raise just by cultivating the desires that are not standard.
Is the niche thing, right? Again, like be the explorer of the new niche and like get the competitive advantage, like which is there.
Absolutely.
Wide open, right?
Yes, by logic. I wanted to ask you about you in the final chapter of your book. You are describing like senescent civilization, and we talked about a lot of topics, a lot of things today. But I think in this chapter, it holds together like everything in a good way under this term. Could you please explain it a bit more?
Sure. First, people need to understand what senescence is and why it happens. Senescence is a not very familiar term. Most people would use the term aging, but the problem is that everything ages just by virtue of time passing, but things like us, creatures, animals, as they age, they grow more feeble and more inefficient over time. And we all recognize this intuitively. The reason that happens, we now biologically understand quite well, which is that the genome is not huge. There are a limited number of genes. And that limited number of genes has to do all of the stuff of the body, and therefore each gene tends to do a multiplicity of things. There will be times when a gene does something that's profoundly good for you early in your life at a cost late in life. And what it took a long time for biologists to realize was that when that happens, selection will prioritize that gene because many, many people in an environment like our ancestors lived in would experience the early life benefit, and they wouldn't live long enough to experience the late life cost. Or if they had, most of their reproduction was already done. And so from an evolutionary point of view, a gene that does something very good for you early at some big cost late is a good deal. So the genome accumulates things that work this way. But it means that we are condemned to fall apart as we get older. Now, the unsettling realization that we came to is that civilization is engaged in exactly this process, and then there's an ugly punchline I'll get to at the end. Civilization, because of the economic modalities that dictate how we are to navigate, does the same thing, where anything that produces a huge profit in the short term at some delayed cost will tend to be reinforced, and we will build this into entire industries. For example, the porn industry, right? Terrifically profitable, and it's just destroying generation after generation of people and their fundamental capacity to interact in the most important way that they ever will. So civilization is accumulating these things, and the prediction is that civilization will come apart just like a person, in their 90s. All you have to do is look at what's happening in the world to know that some process very like that is taking place. our coherence is breaking down in front of our eyes, and we haven't thought about it in these terms. But the other truly tragic punchline is when we senesce, when we grow old and we die, natural selection has produced the perfect solution to this puzzle, which is that we produce offspring, and those offspring, notice, they pick up that fraction of what we accumulated, the important part of what we understood as individuals, our children will pick up, and they will dispense with all of the stuff, all of the nonsense, all of the bad circuitry, right? Now they will have their own confusions, but the point is selection has elegantly solved this problem. The elders, they will fall apart and die. The next generation will pick up the portion of the program that made sense. It will innovate new portions of the program, and they will pass it to their children. That is the solution to senescence. That is the solution, and society doesn't have it. We have no plan for how to take the civilization that is breaking down in front of our eyes and birth a new one that can go on and take the good parts of what we learned and infuse them into the future. In fact, the most likely outcome is that the degradation of civilization is going to destroy the species because of all of the high-tech weaponry, all of the interrelationship, the huge population, the intense rate of consumption. That means that as we blink out, as our civilization reaches its end, it is very likely to take out humanity in the process.
We need to find the fractal connection between the types of senescence, much as I think the connection with Campfire at the individual level and the societal level is very tight. Actually, I think that works. And we can talk, as we do, about civilization level senescence, but it's not as tight an analogy precisely because you don't have elders passing things on to youngers within civilizations. Like you don't have younger civilizations, you have individuals within an existing civilization. So the body politic is not the same thing as an individual body.
That's true, although presumably there will have been many instances in which the elders, the difference between the old habitat and the new one is so profound that effectively we're starting from scratch. So I do think at the moment, if we were functioning coherently, we would recognize the hazard of the moment. We would understand that it is a process of senescence that is doing this and that reversing that process is highly unlikely. And we would engage in some intentional version of fractal Campfire so that at the very least we don't take the species out. We have a contingency plan that at least allows us to get through the bottleneck. But even starting with a fresh sheet of paper, and frankly, I think that fresh sheet of paper, the very top line should say, the global West. We need to found the global West. That means we have to take the values that the West discovered, which really are essentially the ultimate values that one would want. An agreement not to rig civilization in favor of your population and against another population, but to play by the same rules as everybody else. And then the question is, well, what parts of what the ancestors had done in the West worked? What parts of it failed? How would you architect so that those same processes didn't unfold in the future? And, you know, it's lucky. We have the technology to do this at the moment, to have that conversation. And, you know, this is an example of it. We have airplanes, we can meet, we have ability to talk across oceans, and we have the ability to understand the problem at any level we choose to study it. So I guess this is the moment.
Could part of it be maybe that we kind of are failing to integrate like naivety into the world, so like we can solve these actually like paradigmatic, like maybe really solid old problems in a new way, like what's happening when the old generation passes away and the new is born with some kind of like the main set of skills and thinking patterns that it's transferred from the previous generation, but they actually have this opportunity to think from not from the blank slate, but from the slate that has less noise than it was in the previous like older generation. So they can think of new solutions to problems. And we as a society, as this like globalized entity, we actually miss this space where it could be happening.
Well, ironically, our trip to the Czech Republic has opened our eyes to something in a way we were not expecting. And it is a little hard to describe. We have been watching the collapse of the West, and since October 7th and the attack in Israel, it has dawned on many people that not only is the West collapsing, but that it may be too far gone to save it. Because what we have seen is essentially every institution has been captured and has been repurposed for some non-public spirited objective. What we find in the Czech Republic is a surprising example of a society that seems to be functioning according to the rules that we thought had been lost. Now, it's a little hard to know what it means. We've been in Prague. Maybe it's different in the countryside. Maybe there are other examples of this that we haven't seen. But to find even just a population, one can feel it standing on a street, watching people walk by. They are not obsessed with the teams they are on. They're not even really paying attention to each other. They seem to still abide by this agreement to tolerate each other. And we also have found institutions here that seem to be working in the traditional way. So we've been puzzling over this, to be honest. And we have wondered, and this is really, maybe this is just a story, maybe this has some reality to it. We're wondering if the history of the Iron Curtain, in fact, protected the Czech Republic, or will become the Czech Republic, from the corrosive influence of these unregulated market forces that seem to have destroyed the successes of the constitutional republics that we traditionally think of as the West. So, by analogy, if you look at the music of Cuba, the music of Cuba was protected from the market forces that have wrecked music across much of the world by the insulation of Cuba, the embargo, basically the isolation that they experienced under the Soviet regime preserved an isolate of something very important, right? A musical capacity that wasn't so polluted by the music industry. So I don't know if the Czech Republic is basically more intact than the rest of the West, but it seems to be every topic that we can think to ask the question of. Even just walking down the street and seeing normal families, mothers. I can't tell you.
Extraordinary.
It sounds bizarre, but you're not seeing this in the U.S., right? People are actually vocally against having children. They're vocally against marriage. Sometimes they are vocally against the idea of romantic love. They're not into it. And then to come here and see, mothers, fathers holding their children's hands, children skipping down the street, strollers everywhere. This is utterly normal, and it has become so abnormal. And I'm sure it's difficult to see if you live here because it's just the way life is. But to the extent that you have something that is very precious and that is falling apart elsewhere, I think it's important to recognize that you may be the place from which a global West could be rekindled because you remember how to do it.
Well, there's kind of an explosion in my head right now, but we don't know how extreme it is in the US. Therefore, we're just living our lives, right? But I don't know where is it coming from? The need to impose our own perceptions and own maybe rules and beliefs and everything on others, because it feels here in Czech Republic, at least, I mean, also we are in a bubble, of course, like me and Christoph, but like, okay, I can talk with anyone about anything, really. Like, I have my own things that I believe, and I can express my opinion, But I'm curious about the opinion of the other person, right? And yeah, sure, there are people that are going to impose the opinions as well. And there's this like weird propaganda from like East and from West. It's like, yeah, this whole thing is happening here as well. But what was my mind coming to is kind of a frustration because of the Iron Curtain, that we've not lived through that. We've been born into Czech Republic after the revolution, right? But it feels like there's a huge frustration because before the World War II even, we were kind of this kind of a meta country, meta state that people here, Masaryk and others.
I don't know if we were, but it was the idea of
Yeah, that was the
like the
idea.
founder of Czech Republic, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, that
Amazing
we
thinker.
like he wanted the Czech Republic, the Czechoslovakia actually, to be like the meta nation.
Yeah.
So yeah, because we are in this small country in the middle of Europe, and we were under influence of many like authoritarian states in the past, and actually like the Czechs have this this ability to don't care that much about the topics. So because it was in the past, it was always someone actually was imposing some rules on us. So Czechs actually, like to my opinion, like develop the skill to live like in parallel worlds. That they live in the world like under some like authority. So there is these rules, but they have their own world around the campfire actually, when they are meeting in the pub, in a pub or in a community of people, and they have this kind of like very specific sense of humor. And actually, like for me, when you go to the countryside, like Czechs joke about a lot of serious topics. And I think that this is kind of some kind of a firewall against the like hyper seriousness of some topics.
And of having topics be off limits, right? If we joke about serious topics in times of peace, then we will still be able to talk about them when things get very difficult.
So there are a number of things I want to just add into the mix here. One is you asked about why people are so interested in imposing their opinions on others. And I think there are a couple contributors here. One is something, at least in the US, I can tell you with certainty, something wants us divided. And so it is emphasizing things over which we will divide because it keeps us from recognizing that actually we are all imperiled together. So there's some part of this that is cynical. But then there's another part of it which has to do with the fact that there is a normal pattern of development in which what young people think doesn't matter in its immediate consequence. The purpose of those thoughts that the young have is so that they can try things out, discover why they don't work, pick up nuance over time, and eventually develop wisdom. In an environment where the young have access to a huge audience, that you can become an influencer because you say things and suddenly there's a wave of reaction, what we do is we reify people too early. And so their immature thoughts, the unnuanced, unwise version of thinking catches on because, frankly, it's economically very rewarding. And so everybody aspires, how do I become one of those influencers?
Latch onto them, right?
Right, exactly. So part of this is inorganic and cynical, and part of it is just an organic accident of the fact that you can now reach a lot of people even as a very young person, and that's new. But I would also point out, I had said that everything that we think to check here in the Czech Republic matches this pattern of actually the values of the West are alive and well here somehow, including what seems to be a total absence of anti-Semitism at a moment when anti-Semitism is on fire around the world. We are seeing protests in the street in the US, we're seeing it in London, across Europe. This is widespread in Australia. To find a country where there isn't even just the usual ambient level of minor suspicion, there just seems to be a welcoming sense that, there were Jews here, the Nazis killed them, this is a loss, that loss is still felt. It's incredible, but the point is that really is almost the ultimate test of the commitment to these Western values, because the fact of anti-Semitism, it is so easy for it to be triggered. It is so, in some way, I hate to say it, but natural for people to suspect the small population of Jews that often lives in their nations, that to find it not here, even at a moment when it is erupting everywhere else, really says that the commitment to just get along with each other, to collaborate with people who bring something to the table, is very deep. So I don't know how to emphasize that in a way that Czechs realize how special what they have is, but boy, does it seem special at this moment.
We need to translate this part and just broadcast it.
Great.
Onto our Czech podcast as well.
I would like to add something to that, just like to maybe to put the pink glasses off that. The groups are still there, like the groups like as you describe, like anti-Semitic and like all sorts of things, as everywhere in the world, but it's not so vocal here in Czech Republic. It's just like they pop up, like it will get the like media attention, but like the next day it's just gone, basically.
Which, I mean, again, I'm not looking for a world in which people don't have suspicions about each other. That's not a plausible world. But the point is, we have this famous phrase. I'm sure it's actually made it here. The better angels of our nature. And it comes from Abraham Lincoln, who included this in his second inaugural address. And his point was that human beings have both things within them, and that the question is which one will dominate in terms of controlling how we are to interact with each other. It must be the better angels. And that was true when Lincoln said it. It's 1,000 times more true now, because we simply cannot afford for the other influences to dominate our interaction in a planet with nuclear weapons, with the capability to spy on every detail of each other's lives. So that really is the only choice. But no, it's never going to be perfect. Utopia is not only an implausible idea, but it's a very dangerous one. But a deliberate society in which we know what we want and we act to preserve it is quite thinkable and seems to function here.
And I think that's why, for example, meaning and wisdom, whatever it means, it's so relevant topic for many people in the world, and also like it's becoming relevant also for people here in Czech Republic, because it's something that's alive in us, because the not old, like the common categories that we tend to pursue, like social status, finances, reproduction, good mates, like these kind of things that we tend to, some of our actions are done because of these categories. They're not enough because of the noise in the environment and in the digital space. So many people are looking into, okay, what does the meaning mean, and how can I find like more wisdom? And it means just how can I extract the relevant information from myself and then have my actions in the world led by them, and also how can I extract the relevant information from the digital space. And yes, that's why I think like these topics are actually becoming more alive in today's world.
Are you familiar with metamodernism?
Metamodernism?
Yeah.
No.
You're going to have to remind me. I've certainly heard of it, but
Well, it's a kind of actually a new term. It's just here for like 10 to 12 years or something. It was first coined, and it's trying to combine the things that are relevant for modernity and from postmodernism, because both of them have actually some relevant things. And there's this like huge deconstruction of postmodernism, of all the values and everything is just perception and all these things in cultural level. And what metamodernism is trying to do is combine some of the paradoxes and actually design a process that it's not about, oh, we need to be, point C is the final destination and we need to get there, as we maybe thought in the past, but it's trying to actually design, okay, how do I get from A to B? But I don't have to get to B. I just have to know how to walk as a civilization, as a society. And this is the move that is metamodernity is trying to make. And one of the things that it does is that it combines kind of these paradoxic thoughts together as for example, sincere irony. And I think it's like one of the best things to integrate into our lives, because it feels like when we have done some workshops in the US for US companies, it felt like the seriousness, the level of seriousness was so high. And we, both of us, are kind of silly. Like, we just try to joke about ourselves. And whenever we say something and it's too serious, we also know that we are kind of kidding ourselves. Mm-hmm. Because to be authentic, I have to also, and be kind of honest, I have to also integrate the irony of me sounding and being like, oh, I know what's happening. Well, I'm trying to figure it out, and I'm gonna make mistakes, but I'm trying to be sincere and honest, but that contains the irony in itself. And this is something this is a move that is, we're trying to like talk about it a lot, and it feels like this is the move that the West needs to be like, oh, wait, we might be bullshitting ourselves, and be less serious. And then it's more authentic, because we can't be right 100% of the time, and we don't have the truth, right? It's not somewhere. It's like we are humans, and we're malleable, and we have biases and all these things. But it seems to me like we forgot those, or we forgot to, I'm a biased human being, and even if I know about the biases, it might lower them a little bit, but I'm still gonna be biased. Yeah. And this is like, I don't know. It feels like it's less and less in the space, but we know more and more of how biased we are in our perception. So it's like this kind of paradox, and so
I think the word that I have used in the kind of domain where you are here is certainty. That we live in a world that demands certainty from us, and add to that the social media sphere, where what you post, unless you actively scrub your past, is there, and anyone can go back and compare what you say now to what you said then. Add to that the fact that very young people are putting things up, and now you have 12-year-olds, I hope not, but 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 50-year-olds, right? Putting things into the world that others will hold them to, as if it is a virtue to never change your mind. It is not a virtue to never change your mind.
It's really scary.
Right? And as scientists, as humanists, as any kind of creators at all, where did we come up with the idea that we already know everything? We're the omniscient ones? That was never what we thought, right? But now we are being held to this ideal that is not only nonsensical, but almost barbaric. And it's very, very bad for us. And those who would have us never change our minds sort of have us by the puppet strings, right? They can make us dance.
And we are kind of object for them, right? Like, right. Whenever we come into the world, we are object for others, and they label us, and then we have models of how they perceive us, and we are trying to fit their narrative as well. So whenever we go out into the world with some narrative, the world reinforces the narrative itself afterwards, which is like scary. And this is part of consistency bias, and we've tried to develop kind of a firewall for consistency bias, which is like, I'm going to go into the world and I'm going to say this narrative. And the narrative is, I'm a human being that is going to change its mind in the light of new evidence. Therefore, the world is going to expect me to change my mind.
Yeah.
And that's like, oh, okay, that's a part of the solution. And it really helps us, because we said, like, at the start of the podcast, we said, we really are just trying to learn this. We are really bad at this. Like, for the first time, we are trying to talk into the microphone. It was 5 years ago. And it really helped us to just like continue on the way and be like, yeah, we make mistakes, and you can expect that from us.
Yeah. In fact, if it wasn't there, it would raise questions.
Exactly.
You raised the question of metamodernism, which I'm a little hesitant to say anything about because I don't know it as a movement, and it is quite possible for something that sounds like a great thing to be done in a way that's bad or even dangerous. And I would point to, the effective altruism movement, an extension of the rationalists. Right? Rationalism sounds marvelous. Effective altruism sounds like a great idea, but these things are actually a disaster in practice because of certain assumptions that are built into these ways of thinking. But what you describe of metamodernism is a necessary component of what must happen. And in fact, it's a major theme of the book, which is we actually can't go backward. The answer is not some kind of conservatism or some regressive view. There's nowhere to go. right? We do live in a world with birth control. You can't go back to the old rules, which means that we have to architect new rules that make some kind of sense, that will be a mixture of traditional and novel inputs. This then leads to what you say about this movement interested in, you don't have to know where the thing is, you have to know where to walk, which is interestingly resonant with something that we say, which is you can't blueprint the future. You can navigate in the direction that you know that it is. You can prototype your way to it. But those processes are not the same thing as being able to spell it out in advance, which is actually just simply going to be impossible with the given level of complexity. And the last thing I would say is your point about humor is so important for reasons that I believe nobody on earth can spell out. That humor is a primary tool by which human beings investigate that which exists at the edge of their consciousness. And in fact, when people laugh, when a room hears somebody say something and they erupt in laughter, they are revealing that they are all aware of the truth that this person has just placed in front of them, but they weren't aware that everybody else was aware of it. They're kind of co-signing an awareness of something important. And so this is by definition a tool for navigating things that may be relevant that nobody yet has a grasp on. And I would point out that what we are learning about Czech culture on our trip does draw a parallel with Jewish culture, because in Jewish culture, we also laugh often about very dire things. There is a willingness to explore, because those dire things are threats to our ability to continue. It is necessary that we understand the subtleties, not just the platitudes. And in order to figure out what those subtleties are, you have to have access to this sort of advanced cognitive toolkit for seeing it. And it sounds like that same pattern exists possibly for related or maybe different reasons in Czech culture, but it is something that we should fight to preserve, because we are globally now in a situation where our ability, we are narrowing what we're allowed to talk about. We should be doing exactly the opposite. We need to have the full range of possibilities on the table, and we need to be able to talk about them and then say, yeah, actually that whole branch of the tree is bad, but here's how we know. It's not because we decided it was bad before we looked at it. We looked at it, and it turns out every branch on that thing is a dead end.
In a book, you talk in the last chapter about the fourth frontier. Could you explain what does it mean and how we can build one?
Sure.
In simple terms.
Just briefly, right? Just before lunch. Well, the fourth frontier obviously refers to three other frontiers. So let me describe the first three with which we will all be familiar, if not by these numbers, and then Bret will describe the fourth frontier. The first frontier is the one that you first think of when you think of a frontier, a geographical frontier, one in land, where people come into an actually uninhabited by humans landscape and come to inhabit it. The second type of frontier in our numbering system is a technological one, in which humans, by dint of our extraordinary software and ability to adapt and switch niches and create new niches, creates opportunity where there was no opportunity before. So upon learning how to engage in agriculture in the flatlands, people can begin to move up slope by learning to terrace. Right? There was no opportunity for agriculture there before, but the innovation of terracing allows for more food to be grown. The third type of frontier is not legitimate. The first two are. The third type of frontier is not legitimate. It's a form of theft. We call it a transfer of resource frontier, wherein people move into another landscape that is new to them, but it is already inhabited by other people. And they take that from them, either by genocide or theft of resource, which may include, the women or the animals or the wealth in other forms. And there are very few opportunities, predictable opportunities, for the second type of frontier now. The technological frontiers continue to abound, but we can't know when they're going to be coming. The third type of frontier is illegitimate. We should not ever be encouraging this. And we're out of the first type of frontier. We're out of geographic frontiers. We have no new planets, and we're out of land. right? Land on which humans can easily live. So we need a new type of frontier because the sense of growth is what we crave. And we have understood that to mean that we actually need growth. And that.
So just the term growth is confusing because since we encounter it first in an economic paradigm, we sort of think that that's what it's about. And it really isn't. Growth is synonymous with evolutionary success. And the obsession with growth is something that predates our species. In fact, an argument can be made that all creatures are looking for growth opportunities and that these things manifest as increases in their population. So human beings are obsessed with growth in a uniquely human way, but the obsession with growth itself is perfectly generic. Heather's point about these different frontiers, each of them, if you find a new continent in which there are no people, the opportunity to take a population that was stable in size and grow it, 1,000, 10,000 fold exists. That's a huge evolutionary win. So of course it will be experienced. The characteristics that would cause you to seek such things will be built into us very deeply, and the sense that we have found such a thing will be profoundly rewarding. Technology does the same thing, right? If you had a piece of territory and you learned some way to extract more resource from it, then you would experience this great reward. This is the good times. And the point is, those good times have a predictable trajectory. You have the period in which there is literally more than is necessary because you've discovered some new way. And so the way to get valuable things is to just simply work harder or figure out how to refine your role in that new environment. That addiction to growth, though, leads to this third frontier. At the point that there is no technological innovation and your population has reached its limits, then what you're feeling is austerity. There is literally not enough to go around, and that's a problem. That causes tension and strife. And the idea that, well, maybe some other population has resources that it can't defend becomes an irresistible lure. And we say this is not a legitimate frontier because warfare and genocide shrink the global pie. But it doesn't mean they don't enlarge the size of the slice of the population that is deciding to engage in these behaviors. So that is why this has been so characteristic of history. And all of history's greatest tragedies are the result of this transfer of resource endeavor. Our argument in the book is that there is another possibility that we must engage, which is that we navigate to, or prototype our way to, another type of frontier, which is a steady state in which the human beings who are involved have the experience of growth. It feels like the good times, but it feels like the good times in the same way that inside your house it feels like spring in December. Doesn't violate any rules of physics. We know how we do this trick. We use energy, and we warm your house with it in a very standard way. But the point is, life is superior when the inside of your house is springtime, and the mechanism for doing it is something that we had to learn over time. So what we need is an environment that gives the people the sensation of growth. How does that feel? Well, one feels liberated. One feels that their basic needs are taken care of and that they can point their conscious mind at important puzzles. The meaning crisis becomes an opportunity to find real meaningful work and to do it and to contribute something. And so it is a non-utopian, architected steady state that no one on earth can tell you how to build, but we do know what direction it lies in. It would depend on some source of energy that was not finite and experiencing a diminishing return on energy investment over time. We would need something like fusion power in order to get there. Now, our low investment in finding viable fusion power is a perennial mystery to me, but I would offer one final caution. You're going to need something like fusion power or some alternative to it in order to fuel a fourth frontier. A fourth frontier is no more unthinkable than a house in which the temperature is always pleasant. But if we were to find the technology necessary to build a fourth frontier, and we were just simply to introduce it to the world as it stands today, it would probably make things much worse rather than much better. It would become a weapon of economic warfare rather than the solution to the warfare that lineages conduct against each other. So we need to prepare the world for the discovery of something too important to become a private weapon of displacement.
That is used in the third frontier.
Yes. Exactly.
This is huge because, as you mentioned, the finite energy that we have, because right now we are living through carbon pulse, and many do not realize that. And we are not accounting the price of oil for the millions of years that it's been created. And it's just going to run out, right?
Right.
And it's very dense energy that is actually not that easily replaceable as we think with the other analogy. So there's this great thought of great simplification by Nate Hudgens and Daniel Schmachtenberger. I think they talked about it quite a lot. But the fourth frontier is, for me, it's like too abstract now. Is there some more specific things apart from the energy? Is there some? You said that we have the kind of navigation.
Well, we've really been talking about it for the whole podcast, right?
Yeah.
There is an element of this that is fundamentally about values. You can't have a stable fourth frontier if we haven't all agreed on not rigging the world in favor of our lineage against others. So, the basic principles of the West are inherent to what you would build. They would need to be built into a new form that was not vulnerable to collapse the way the current West is apparently vulnerable to collapse. So we need to discover what it is, if it is the economic influences of unfettered capitalism that overwhelmed the values of the West, then we need to figure out how to insulate the new global West from that force. I would suggest a place to start on that front is the recognition that markets are by far the best, most powerful tool that we have ever discovered for figuring out how to accomplish things. But they are an absolutely appalling tool for figuring out what to accomplish. And because we don't distinguish these things, because we decide that whatever it is that generates a profit is inherently valid, what these things do, markets will explore every defect in our values and our personalities and exploit it. We can't allow that to happen. This is a tool for solving problems, but no problem in which the size of the collective pie is reduced is a valid solution to anything. You need a system that fosters the discovery of things that enlarge the collective pie. That is going to include enriching people who make such contributions. We are not all going to live at the same level of wealth, nor should we want that. That's not a viable system. But you shouldn't be able to get rich by destroying wealth. And a large fraction of the fortunes that exist on Earth today are the product of people who were able to destroy wealth and make a profit by doing it. So the fourth frontier would have to exclude that. Yeah. That is a destabilizing force.
So it would have to include non-zero-sum games.
Precisely.
Yes.
It would have to effectively function so as to seek all opportunities for truly non-zero-sum games viewed over the long term. Again, remember what the senescence of civilization is caused by, the competition of short-term gain over long-term. So it has to say, what is the net cost of this going forward, which then forces us to understand that we can't know. So you have to budget for what is possible, and I would say it might be a little hidden in the book, but it's there, is that the focus on sustainability ultimately is right, but it's only half of the puzzle. The other half of the puzzle is reversibility. You have to be able to take anything that transforms our world, and if you discover that the unintended consequences of it cause it to be net negative, you have to be able to undo it in a meaningful way. It doesn't mean you have to be able to put every stone back where it came from, but as you generate the potential to change the world, you have to generate the potential of equal proportions to reverse course. And again, if you look at the disasters that have unfolded on planet Earth, from the financial collapse to the Fukushima disaster to the Deepwater Horizon disaster, all of these things, the COVID crisis, they all have the same description, right? We innovated a technology capable of doing a kind of damage that we did not have the capability to undo, right? that shouldn't be the case. If you're going to drill deep in the ocean, right, you have to have the ability to cap a leak that happens deep in the ocean. Those things should have been developed in tandem, and to the extent that they weren't, that was a completely foreseeable problem.
We are coming to an end. I just have to mention this. It feels like there is a need of something that you write about in the book, which is something that is literally false, but metaphorically right. It's like, because it's a complex system, it needs something, I don't know what it is. Like, I don't know. It's just some story that we need to tell ourselves to be able to do this and then kind of come together in a way. I mean, there was this story of that the earth is alive or whatever, you know.
Right.
It might be a metaphorically right story for us. It literally might not be true, and I guess there exists something that is actually going to provide us with a reason to do non-zero sum games. There was just one thought. And I want to ask you, are there any maybe red pills that you've recently came about that you would share in past weeks, months, years?
I feel like it's been decades.
Well, I would say a couple things. Let me flesh out the literally false, metaphorically true thing, and then take a dangerous step with it. That idea was initially something we generated to address the question of religion, which obviously is evolutionarily adaptive, and yet much of the content of the claims of all religions are demonstrably false. So the question is, how can false things be fostered by an adaptive process, which you would think would be fueled by insight into what's true? And the answer is that actually true doesn't mean one thing. In this case, you would expect evolution to favor things that caused your behavior to be adaptive, irrespective of whether or not the stories included there were literally accurate. Now, here's the dangerous experiment. The story that we have been experimenting with, the West is in collapse. That is likely because unfettered capitalism was too powerful and it overwhelmed the values that undergird the West. And the Czech Republic is exceptional, perhaps because the Iron Curtain, as terrible as it was, insulated the Czech Republic from some of those caustic influences of the market. That is quite possibly a literally false but metaphorically true story. And the question is it good enough to do what we need to do now, which is to take the example of what functions, irrespective of why it actually functions, and say, okay, how do we do this? How do we globalize it so that it actually gives every person, the new global West is not a geographic description, right? It is a thing defined by the values and the rights that protect those values that allow a tolerant cosmopolitan society to exist. Is the story good enough for us to move forward, right? It's a narrative. Maybe it's true. Maybe it's partially true. We have a principle. You cannot write a myth. You can write a story, and then evolution can shape it into a myth, right? Maybe this is a story, and maybe it will be shaped into something more significant and durable by insights, by poets, by whoever it is that will shape this into something timeless. But we can't know. So we're simply practicing this. And the last thing I will say before Heather jumps in here is there is a barrier to understanding this that comes from the fact that scientists almost inevitably tell themselves that they are apart from whatever that thing is. Some will say religion is a mind virus. Most people are wrong. Some will acknowledge that, oh, maybe it was an adaptation to past environments. What is almost universally rejected is that even the proper conduct of science does not remove faith. It minimizes it. It reduces the amount of faith necessary to do the job. It takes as much faith out of the stories as we can take out. But even something as durable and important as the periodic table and our description of electrons and how they will interact around different nuclear cores, the story of electrons is not one that anybody can explain in perfectly rigorous terms. What is it? Is it a thing? Is it a wave? Is it a cloud of probabilities? The point is we have a story, and we can show you in the textbook, oh, here's the electron. Oh, and it's in a group of different orbitals. But we're describing as if it were a billiard ball, and we know that it isn't. Right? Yeah. We have a story that is good enough for us to do chemistry, an amazing chemistry, but it's not a true story. It contains some metaphorical truth, and it's good enough, and eventually we'll have a better story that will be even more useful to us. But we have to get over the idea that any of us are free from using metaphorical truth because it's such a key to human functionality.
Yeah. I mean, you got most of where I wanted to go.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's good. Orbital shells are metaphors. This is, for me, this is one of the best examples in science of like, really? Shells? In neat ordered concentric spheres? I don't think so. But there is something real there that the metaphor of the orbital shell allows chemists to get to something that is true and thus explain other things. And I think the literally false, metaphorically true framework is related to science in another way, which is too often in modern science we focus on mechanism. And we imagine, many scientists practicing, and therefore most of the population who hears about science from journalists only. Imagine that if you don't know how, then you don't know anything. And mechanism is understood to be the only thing that matters. But very often, we don't know how something works, and yet we can see that it does. And that is where literally false, metaphorical true stories become extremely valuable. Sometimes we do know a truth and it's really complicated, and story is used as a sort of a way to get around the complications and to arrive us at something. But very often it is actually we just don't know. But that doesn't mean that we don't know. If we don't know how, that doesn't mean that we don't know anything about the system. This is a really reductionist version of science that says the only thing that you can understand is how it works. We, as evolutionary biologists, are more interested in why anyway, and the how is often at a different scale of explanation that is actually relevant to the question we're asking. So saying, okay, that thing that you're saying sounds really woo to me, or sounds off because I know something that it contradicts, but the thing that you arrive at feels like it could be right. So let's skip over the places where you feel certain, and I'm going to go, that's a black box for me. That's a black box. I don't think your explanation is right. There's going to be something else that goes there, and let's talk about the conclusion and see what else must be true if that's true.
So Heather alludes to the fact that evolutionists are more interested in why than how. I want to point out how this fits into this story, because actually I don't think this should be the way it is. This is a historical accident. So at the point that Darwin finally phrases the story of natural selection so that we can begin to utilize it as a rigorous scientific concept, we don't really have any ability to look into the cells and understand them in any detail. We literally don't know how the information is even passed. We don't know what the nature of the information is. We just infer that it exists and that it changes over time, and it does so in a direction that makes the creature more effective. But because of that, evolutionary biologists who scored all of their early successes over in Y space have gotten out of the habit of thinking about how space. And there is no reason. It's not less evolutionary. It's just more technical and not something that we have a tradition of exploring. And I think you alluded at the beginning of the podcast to the story of the mice and the telomeres. This is a place where actually I have an instinct to investigate the how, but I'm decidedly an evolutionary biologist. That's my approach to the how, right? I'm looking at mechanism, but from an evolutionary perspective. And the truth is that there's a tremendous amount of value to be gained at developing the skill of understanding the mechanistic material in rigorous evolutionary terms that is largely untapped just for reasons of historical accident. And so in some ways, what we've said is metaphorical truth is necessary to do science, even highly rigorous science, chemistry, for example. However, the ability to do rigorous science using metaphorical truth has allowed a field, evolutionary biology, to explore one layer without obligation to explain the layer below it. But then at the point that the ability to explore that layer below it arrives, we don't think to do it. And that is a mistake that we should overcome because, frankly, the pie will grow. As soon as we evolutionarily understand that level in detail, we will be much more capable of understanding its implications. So it's a well ready to be tapped that we are just simply ignoring. That's right in front of our eyes.
Beautiful. Unfortunately, we don't have much more time, but I would like to ask you for any last words that you have for our listeners and for ourselves, if there are any.
Yeah, it's been a total pleasure, this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it really has, and it has been a very hopeful experience to discover so many thoughtful people here, with whom we appear to share a great many values and a curiosity about life and an interest in the future. And I guess I would just say, I don't think I've ever seen a more dangerous moment in my life. But the lesson of evolutionary biology, maybe one of the deepest ones, is that the transition between ways of existing, moving from one evolutionary peak to the next, involves going through adaptive valleys, which are inherently perilous. And there is truly nothing that guarantees that we make it to the other side. But the fact that things look very dark at the moment is automatic. That is the stuff that motivates people to discover the next way that they will be. And it is that moment. And it's wonderful to discover that there are many people interested in partnering on that project.
Thank you so much for your time and for what you put into the world. We really appreciate it. And hopefully we're going to be able to talk next time, sometime next
Great.
Yes.
We look forward to it.
And thank you so much. It was really, I've tons of insights. I've had different states of being throughout the conversation, which is a sign of quality conversation for me at least. So thank you so much for this.
Thanks. It's been
Yes,
a real pleasure.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thanks for all the listeners, and see you and talk to you next time. Bye.
Bret and Heather.